been asked to speak for 10 to 15 minutes on, frankly, US-China relations and where that places us in terms of the future of global economic governance involving the Chinese and the Americans, and where that places us in turn in the future of global digital governance, given the reality of the Chinese and the Americans as the two giant elephants in the global living room. I'm joining you from Singapore today, so it's 7 o'clock in the morning, and little grey cells haven't quite begun to collide yet, as Hercule Poirot would say, but I'm optimistic that halfway through my presentation, some of the synapses will be connecting. Firstly, in terms of what we're looking at with US-China, several hours' time, we have, of course, the first Biden-Xi Jinping summit. Of itself, this is not insignificant. There has not been an effective summit between the two countries really for about 4 years. The last one occurred under Donald Trump in his what the great marketeer called the Summit Plus, Super Summit with bells and whistles on, held in Beijing from memory in November of 2017. The Chinese thought they'd succeeded in assuaging Trump. Trump launched the trade war against China in March of 18. It continued through 2018 and 2019. We then had an interim truce in the signing of the Phase 1 trade agreement between China and the United States in the White House in January of 2020, which actually I remember attending myself as a member of the audience in the East Room. And that was just as COVID was breaking out in Wuhan and across the country, which then determined the politics of 2020, which took the pre-existing trade frictions between the two countries, compounded the public health dimensions of what the Americans then described as the Wuhan virus, the China virus, or in Trump's inevitable gift of Shakespearean English, the Kung flu, which then caused what was left of the US-China relationship by then to spiral completely out of control. That, of course, saw, for a whole range of other factors, the change in administration in the United States. And in the first 12 months of the Biden administration, effectively the tonality, and the content, and the structure of the US-China relationship has not changed from where it had reached as of the end of the Trump administration. In the two successive sets of senior officials meetings, first in Anchorage, Alaska, which many of you would have seen, and secondly, most recently, between Yang Jiechi, China's chief foreign policy advisor to President Xi, and Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor of the United States in Switzerland. These did not, in terms of their optics, though less so in terms of their content, contribute to what might be described as any normalization of the overall relationship. What it did, however, was pave the way, particularly the Sullivan-Young meeting of a month or so ago, to this inaugural summit, albeit virtually, between Xi Jinping and Biden, which is about to unfold. So this goes to the content of what we best are able to discern from the tea leaves, both in Beijing and Washington, as to what both sides want, what is likely to be agreed, and what therefore that means for the rest of us as third parties wrestling with the challenges of global governance in the ensuing period. My operating assumption, both from our discussions in Washington and Beijing, is that both sides have concluded it is not in their separate national interests to preside over a further qualitative decline in the bilateral relationship. They believe that it's important for this relationship at the level of politics and diplomacy to bottom out, that is, to reach its natural bottom and not to simply continue to spiral down. And there's a reason for that, and that is that they don't want to be presented with an environment which becomes unmanageable politically, both internally and bilaterally, if they find a crisis event which both sides then have to contend with, either through a collision of ships in the South China Sea, a collision of aircraft somewhere in the Taiwan Straits, or in the East China Sea between the Japanese and the Chinese, or any other crisis in either cyber or space. So what do I interpret from that? Not a return to any status quo ante in the US-China relationship, but a predisposition on both parts to now re-establish, after 4 years, an effective bilateral mechanism for managing the relationship in order to prevent it from spiraling further. I'm therefore not optimistic we're going to see any significant, as it were, bilateral initiative. The politics in both Beijing domestically and in the United States don't readily permit that at this stage. But there is a constituency to stabilise. And that, I think, is not a bad outcome. A second good outcome would be to establish the beginnings of a framework for what I've described in the public literature on this for the last several years, is a doctrine of managed strategic competition. They may or may not use that term. The Chinese do not want to use the term competition because it is a fundamental assault on their concept of, quote, win-win cooperation, a fundamental assault on their notion of China's peaceful development, a fundamental assault on their domestic propaganda emphasis that China is out to solve the world's problems, not to be competed against by the rest of the world in dealing with those problems. Of course, the US administration, and in particular, the United States Congress, have a radically different view. They've already concluded that we're in the midst of strategic competition, and I think objectively that is the case. But what you're likely to see, I think, is, and maybe these terms will be used, is the emergence of new guardrails in the relationship, terms which I've used within the framework of strategic competition, and those of us who present papers to both governments on this question. Guardrails in the sense of mindful of strategic red lines. What are the mechanisms which can exist bilaterally to prevent the relationship from falling off a cliff either side of the road through miscommunication and misadventure? And also having identified those guardrails to prevent crisis and conflict and escalation, to then begin to identify areas of potential collaboration, which brings us into the space which I think this conference is seeking to deal with, what those might be for the future. Obviously, you've seen coming out of Glasgow this joint statement by Xie Jinping, the chief Chinese negotiator, and John Kerry, and where that may now go to on climate. The reconstitution of the bilateral US-China Climate Working Group, which was established first under the Obama administration and then was killed by the Trump administration. This is a really important piece of machinery which is now being reconstituted. If you look at its working agenda on areas such as methane, where the Chinese haven't signed up to a global methane agreement, but are going to advance that now bilaterally with the Americans. On forestation, deforestation, and reforestation, carbon sinks, plus, most critically in the third area, technology and technology standards, which is code language also for vehicle emission standards and electric cars in the future. These are substantive areas of potential work. What is missing, however, in terms of the rest of the collaborative agenda is what that may look like beyond climate. Salvaging climate from the jaws of bilateral political death has been difficult enough. My own think tank, the Asia Society Policy Institute, has been working in 1.5-track diplomacy between the Democrats and the Chinese climate change policy community for the last 2 years in order to try and salvage this out of the fire. And we're quite pleased about the fact that we've done that. But knowing, therefore, something of the bilateral political dynamics, it's very difficult at this stage to extract other elements. The next and most obvious candidate, if you are looking at the global governance machinery, where this needs to happen, is, of course, in, let's call it, rolling pandemic management. Given that there's been a spectacular failure of global governance so far in the management of the pandemic since the first eruption in the beginning of 2020, through to the fact that, in fact, the pandemic, rather than producing a new global public good and global collaboration, in fact, went in the reverse direction as it became an exercise of geopolitical competition and national one-upmanship in terms of vaccine diplomacy with the G77 and elsewhere. So the open question for both administrations is, in the next iteration of the virus, whatever that iteration might be, a further mutation or other forms of pandemic, as to whether the political capital out of this Biden-Xi Jinping summit can move us in that direction. The third element I'll touch on before closing my remarks, Oliver and Hinton, and then turning it to Q&A, is in this vexed area of digital governance. Right now, I see limited prospects, to be blunt, of any level of convergence between the Chinese and American systems on this. This is seen right now in Washington and Beijing as an area of full throttle strategic competition, not just in terms of, let's call it, the objective technology stakes, not just in terms of who achieves, quote, technological dominance. China's national industrial plans, Made in China 2025, but now the successor plans to that, which take China out to 2049, are all about not just national technological self-reliance, but about national digital autonomy and about their own doctrine of national digital security, hence their domestic crackdowns against their own digital platforms, including Alibaba and Tencent and the others. And so when I look at the degree of daggers drawn in the technology race between the two countries across the range of high technologies, digital technologies, and digital innovation, and within that, again, the primal competition now underway in terms of the future of semiconductors, this is getting worse, not better. And the final point in terms of the digital space that I therefore draw your attention to is on the architecture of global digital governance. This group, more than any others, understands the different approaches to digital governance from, let's call it, the Chinese state-centric model, the European citizen-centric model, and the American, dare I say it in crude terms, corporate-centric model, and a difficult dialogue of a transatlantic nature before you get to, let's call it, the trans-Pacific nature of the dialogue with the Chinese, and trying to find a landing point. However, there's a central item of Chinese domestic digital governance and global digital governance standards to maximize the penetration of China's preferred digital governance model around the world. They will seek to do what they can with their BRI, Belt and Road Initiative partners around the world, to build a global constituency around state-centric global digital governance models, And of course, the Europeans and the United States will be working in different directions on that. But the prospects, therefore, emerging of any level of convergence about global digital governance at this stage, given the underlying geopolitical factors I outlined before, do not appear to be rosy, positive, or great. And so I'll leave my comments there, Hinton and Oliver, and welcome the general conversation.
Kevin, thank you. When we requested you to join us, we were hoping for that sort of setting the stage, big picture, given your deep understanding of China, and then help us understand our own topic. And so thank you for that very sobering view. Two things, by the way, we have about half an hour for discussion, and I suggest that you raise your virtual hand. I'm taking note of who wants to come in with either a comment or question for Kevin. And we'll bunch them in twos and threes and then go back to Kevin every few minutes for his reactions. But two things caught me among many in what Kevin said. One was China's deeply, and I gather sincerely held view that it is not in competition, but actually there is still that sense of peaceful rise. But second, it has its own very sort of strong views on what constitutes peaceful rise, and that they may not be compatible with how the European Union and how the US see the growth and development of digital technologies. And I think it's that confluence of the two that leads Oliver, in my view, to our work being cut out for us in some ways in this conference and beyond. Any thoughts from you, Oliver, before we take questions and comment from our colleagues?
I think the one question I'd be very interested indeed to hear some further observations on from Kevin as we move forward is whether the degree of if I can put it as mutual trust, perhaps that's the wrong word, but lessening of mutual antagonism potentially emerging from these talks and from what's gone on at COP26 and so on might carry over even into managing things such as digital governance, or whether your view is that ultimately there are just topics too difficult for the next several years to be seriously discussed between the two.
Yeah, Oliver, the way in which I see it is that from the Chinese perspective, geopolitically with the United States, they do not see an advantage lying in a further deterioration in the bilateral relationship between now and the end of next year. At the end of next year is the 20th Party Congress, which Xi Jinping will seek a reappointment as for a record third term. And if that occurs, which I believe it will, then he becomes effectively leader for life. And therefore is as I wrote the other day, I think in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend, he will therefore put himself in the position of being the counterpart of at least 5 sets of US presidents rather than the reverse. So he becomes this force for continued, shall I say, strategic continuity on China's part. Second, in this possible strategic lull between now and the end of 2022, the most I can see realistically unfreezing will be further climate collaboration, possibly a new discourse on the pandemic, and possibly some decision not to further accelerate existing bilateral trade tensions. But to underline what I said before, I do think that we are unlikely to see any progress in terms of, let's call it, the digital agenda. It is just too deeply enmeshed now into a deep race for global supremacy on technology across the board, digital technology in particular, artificial intelligence in particular, and a competition for the governance regimes as well. It doesn't mean that we should, therefore, through organizations such as this, cease to do work, but we need to be absolutely realistic about the nature of the battlefield that we are entering in, from the geopolitics of this, both on the substance of individual technologies plus the prevalence of the governance regimes. A final footnote to the above is that you are also seeing, I think, at relevant global governance meetings through the international machinery on technical standards associated with the digital world, China swarming these conferences with very large numbers of policy and technical experts working overtime with governance, with countries from the G77 and elsewhere in the world in order to create its own, as it were, force, its own diplomatic and political momentum around its own, let's call it state-centric governance models. So therefore, I assume Europe and I assume the United States, obviously I know the United States, have a different take on this. So to understand the dimensions of the competitive nature of what China is now doing with third countries to bring them into the state-centric governance model, I think is part of the eyes wide open approach we need to collectively have as we approach this debate through institutions like CIGI and others. Back to you.
Okay. Kevin, do you think if we assume that the characteristics of this industry are indeed winner takes all and of non-stop economies of scale over conceivable output levels, is China's desire to dominate strictly one of corporate growth and an economic interest to make sure that it has a next generation set of industries that drive economic growth and maintain that Chinese compact with its people? Or is there something more at play as well that has to do with political systems and social organization, which these technologies are also very adept at shaping and reinforcing?
I think from China's own digital governance perspective, its global view is shaped by its domestic view almost in entirety. And so when I look at Chinese domestic digital governance and what's occurred over the period of Xi Jinping's administration, the securitization of the digital agenda within China has been profound and comprehensive. Often in the outside world, we simply say, look at what's happening in Xinjiang, and that's kind of it. Well, not really. It is a much broader Chinese concern on the part of the Chinese Communist Party to use digital security to maximize its control over its corporate sector, but also its general population as well. In the past, for example, when I've looked, and I've been through the Alibaba campus many times in Hangzhou with Jack Ma, and looked at all sorts of innovations in terms of global digital commerce, obviously Alibaba's global platforms for doing that through institutions such as Taobao and the rest. And I've also looked at how, for example, corporations like Alibaba have sought, prior to incurring the wrath of the Chinese Communist Party, to help solve practical problems of local governance. For example, in the city which Alibaba is located, Hangzhou in China, Alibaba for a long period of time has provided maximal data and digital troves of digital information to the municipal traffic authorities to manage Hangzhou's traffic flow. And they've done it remarkably well. And there are panels that you can see at Hangzhou at the Alibaba campus, which indicate their collaboration with the municipal government in just maximizing the unclogging of a city of about 12 million people. That, however, was not good enough for the Chinese Communist Party. They became concerned about the level of digital information available to these individual corporations outside the direct control of the Chinese Communist Party. They became particularly concerned about that in relation to the hail and road company, Didi. And whereas ostensibly the reservation raised by China was the nature of Didi's listing on the New York Stock Exchange as opposed to on a local stock exchange, either in Shenzhen, Shanghai, or even Hong Kong. The internals were very much about digital security and digital governance. And therefore, if I look at the new digital governance compliance requirements for Chinese corporations, it's becoming bigger, larger, more comprehensive. The Chinese will then say to you, nothing new here compared with what the United States is now doing and the Europeans are now doing in reining in the giant tech platforms globally because of the concerns which they've presented either in terms of individual citizens' privacy or the question of, shall we say, macro political manipulation through algorithms and politics, etc. So the Chinese will say defensively and offensively, we're not doing anything that you guys are not doing in the West. However, I would be misleading you to say that this is simply a benign attempt on the part of the Chinese Communist Party to defend the rights of its citizens. It's a deep concern about data sources being available to private corporations, which are then potentially available to foreign governments through, as it were, foreign shareholdings in those corporations, plus their own direct interest in maximizing, shall we say, algorithmic control mechanisms of their own population. The algorithms now governing China's domestic social media platforms are quite phenomenal in the way in which they, for example, manage China's domestic nationalism debate. If you want to read a book on this, I don't have it with me at the moment, or do I? It's called China's Digital Nationalism. Let me try and find a copy of it. I think I'll send it to you. It's only come out literally through Oxford University Press in the last year or so. And the scholarship which has gone into this is, I think, world class. So I'll leave my comments there, Brandon.
Great, thank you. Any additional questions? Doug has a question. Go ahead, Doug. Unmute yourself, and for others, if you have questions, raise your hand. We have about 10 minutes left in this session, maybe 15 if Kevin can stay.
Yeah, I have a question actually about B2B e-commerce. Most e-commerce in most of the world outside of China goes business to business. And despite the Chinese government's efforts to develop independent standards, China is not a bubble. It's still trading quite heavily with North America. There's a need for facilitation, for digital facilitation of business-to-business trade. And my question is whether or not small-scale trust-building measures might not be developed, for example, in the context of the WTO's ministerial conference at the end of this month, to have an early harvest of an accord that provides an early harvest of trust-building measures around mutual recognition of standards for e-invoicing and e-signatures and the authentication of documents. This type of very pragmatic trade and business facilitating step that would contribute to building of trust and make businesses on both sides of the Pacific better off in their ability to conduct that commerce. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. It's a really important question. It's got a fairly rich recent history, actually. Alibaba, my knowledge of them, had begun working in this direction at least 5 years ago. You may recall Jack Ma's original statement, I think probably in New York, about the need to develop a EWTO set of rules in order to govern the future dynamics of global digital commerce. Obviously, Jack and the Alibaba team were talking up their own book because at that stage they were globally dominant in the space. And as you know from your own experience, the Chinese digital payment system domestically is phenomenal. I mean, hard sort of physical currency kind of ceased to exist effectively in China a long time ago, as everything is done through these devices. But what is really interesting in terms of the evolution of this within China itself, Doug, is that, and I know this at a level of granularity, is that about 2 years ago, when Jack started to experience his difficulties with the Chinese authorities, and perhaps a little more than that, and he was engaged with the Chinese regulatory authorities on how to roll out the sort of global system and all of its associated softwares and mutually agreed regulatory arrangements, including security of payment systems, etc., is that the Chinese Ministry of Commerce put a huge roadblock on that because they saw it as a subversion of the role of the state. And since then, this would, in my judgment, have rolled out almost spontaneously as a bottom-up B2B initiative globally, had the Chinese state not intervened. And the reason I know a little bit about this is that Alibaba were working, had initial conversations with me about how this might actually operationalize. And that proceeded for quite a period of time until it ran into the roadblock of the Chinese state. So I'd like to say, Doug, that the WTO will now be empowered to move in this direction. Maybe it will be if the Chinese Commerce Ministry, which is responsible for foreign trade, now has its writing instructions about what B2B it will now permit. But the idea of it being generated from B to global Bs and then be subsequently authorized by G, I think has disappeared out the back window with the rise of the Chinese state, if that makes sense in what I've just said.
I guess the subtext to your question, Doug, is also that unlike the previous Cold War, China is so much a part of the global supply and value chains that there are limits to how much disconnecting we can do and how much ring fencing we can do around these issues as well, Kevin.
Yeah, I think China, as a number of you have correctly anticipated in your thoughts, observations, and questions, is caught in something of a dilemma, which Rohinton has just pointed to. On the one hand, it's sorry, I've got a few technical problems here. On the one hand, China's economic rise has been driven, to be frank, by net exports and to a lesser extent by foreign direct investment. And the degree of China's integration with the global economy is now significant. Second, however, and this is the perverse consequence of the US-China trade war, initiated by, how do I put this delicately, the idiot Trump, is that the geostrategic conclusion in Beijing, as a result of that, was that one form or another of US-initiated decoupling from China was going to unfold. 5G was the obvious case in point, and Huawei. The new restrictions around semiconductors in general, involving both Samsung and TSMC, was a second front. And then thirdly, other restrictions in terms of all the dimensions of artificial intelligence. And so what I began to observe then during the course of 2018 and 2019, and certainly by the time we get to about April to June of 2019, is a new commentary emerging in the Chinese official press about the need for a new form of, quote, national self-reliance, unquote. Now, this term, which, as you know, is the antithesis of continued globalization, had this term, national self-reliance, the Chinese word is zili gengsheng, had not really been around a whole lot since the Cultural Revolution. And it's been a political and geopolitical response to what they have anticipated to be a level of decoupling by the United States initiated by the US itself. Furthermore, if I read carefully the entrails of what Xi Jinping has been saying about this, Rohinton, it's been along these lines that that China does not want to be, as it were, the passive recipient of incoming damage by US-driven technology bans, boycotts, and restrictions, and other potential restrictions in technology markets, capital markets, and talent markets in the future. And that instead, China will execute its own, and they do not use this term, but decoupling with Chinese characteristics in order to reduce their own vulnerabilities. And that is very much alive in what you will hear in Chinese macroeconomic debates. It's now described as the, quote, Chinese dual circulation economy model. What is dual circulation economy model? And deciphering this, these complex terms, or sometimes called banner terms, kicked around in the Chinese public discourse is always problematic. But essentially it means this. In the past, we've been had a growth model which has been primarily driven by net exports, and let's call it globalization writ large. Two, in the future, we're going to engineer a growth model which is primarily driven by domestic consumption. And three, we will only allow ourselves to have a traded sector of the economy which does not leave us vulnerable to the external actions of others in the future. Hence the concept of national self-reliance. And four, and this is the critical point for those of you engaged in, let's call it global standards and global governance debates. Xi Jinping uses this language. We will use, however, the global gravitational pull of the Chinese economy in goods markets, in service markets, in capital markets, and prospectively in technology markets to begin to exercise much greater leverage over global regulatory debates and global standards debates, so that we will have a globalization now with Chinese characteristics. And that's my paraphrase of multiple statements made by the Chinese administration. It goes under the rubric of the dual circulation economy. Dual circulation meaning domestic demand on the one hand, foreign demand on the other, with domestic demand being dominant, but foreign demand also providing a national opportunity for China to begin to leverage global regulatory debates and standards debates, given its much greater economic heft in the world and increased global dependency on the Chinese market on the part of global corporations, given the size of the Chinese market relative to the balance sheet, for example, of a Morgan Stanley, as opposed to the significance of those institutions in aggregate to the Chinese capital market, which will still be relatively small, given the indigenous growth of Chinese capital markets. So I think understanding where China's new concept of globalization fits is sobering. As I said, I partly, not exclusively, lay some responsibility for this at the US-initiated trade war back in 2018 and the wonderful world of unintended consequences in which we usually live. Rohit, if I suddenly go blank, it's because I'm running out of battery, but I'll then come back on a different device. So,
No worries. No, look, Kevin, you have given us everything we were hoping for and more. And where you ended in some ways is where the conference has to begin, which is, do we even have a common understanding of integration and globalization, going beyond economic issues to sort of questions of identity and ideas. And I think that's very, very well put. You're welcome, Kevin, to stay for as long as you wish. We'd love to have you for more. But if it's okay with you, we'll kind of move on to the next session. And thank you again for having joined us in what's early in Singapore, but much appreciated, as always, I should say.